Very soon, my friends Brett and Alice from the Prosecutors Podcast and Javier Leyva of the Pretend Podcast will be releasing an episode where they do an interview with Javier on the series he's been working on called Who's Afraid of LaDonna Humphrey. Um, I just wanted to release this interview with Julie Murray on LaDonna Humphrey that was released last month on our Patreon as a Patreon bonus episode. It'll give you an idea of what you can get for $3 a month by joining our Patreon. And it also explores LaDonna Humphrey's role in the Maura Murray case, one that was surprising to us and really has shifted our view of what had happened there. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie for this discussion. If you're interested in our Patreon, you can find us at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. Hey, folks. This is a Patreon only bonus episode with Julie Murray, the sister of Maura Murray, who disappeared in 2004. Along the way, the Murray family has taken every measure humanly possible to find their sister. In that, they've come across some people who have been unbelievably helpful and supportive of them, and they've come back many people who had different kinds of motives. In this bonus episode, we're going to discuss one of my former guests, LaDonna Humphrey, who became entangled in the Maura Murray story very early on. Julie has recently spoken out about her family's interactions with LaDonna, and we wanted to share this Patreon bonus episode to touch a little bit on the dark side of true crime. So, Julie, what I wanted to ask you about, I had noticed you had a recent appearance on Javier Leyva's podcast, the Pretend Podcast, to talk about this season, his season's Who's Afraid of LaDonna Humphrey. And, many of my listeners know that I know LaDonna. I had met her in 2023 at Crime Con. She had been described to me by fellow podcasters as a advocate for victims, somebody who ran a true crime, festival, a foster mom, and just sort of like tirelessly fighting for victims. And I think the beginning of, I think it was probably this year, I had a conversation with her, and it was about missing and unidentified cases. And I consider myself a relatively savvy person, although anyone who knows me really well, Julie, will tell you that I'm actually secretly naive. And as it turned out, I was at CrimeCon in 2024, so the end of May, and I had tickets to a dinner that I was going to, bringing a bunch of friends to that dinner, and but apparently LaDonna was having an event offsite, and so when I came out of that event, I had a message from LaDonna saying that she was really disappointed that I didn't make it to her event, and she was wondering whether I was mad at her, which all of a sudden sent my alert signals up. I'm like, what's going on? And I started to ask around, and someone told me about Javier's podcast. I reached out to him that weekend, and we connected, and I began to hear about some of the misdeeds. I did not know that your family was involved in it all until the recent episode. And, I felt kind of fooled, right? As somebody who comes from a world of journalism and investigating things. And, I also have a lot of experience in mental health work. So I'm used to sort of picking up on things. But I was just shocked when I heard about her involvement in your family's case and kind of the impact it had on you. I wanted to ask you just sort of a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've had very limited experience with LaDonna, and the interaction that I did have and my family had was sort of a one-off. So back in 2006, 2007, LaDonna had a nonprofit, and it was called Let's Bring Them Home, and it was based out of Arkansas. And she I believe, saw my sister's story on the news and reached out and offered assistance. And at that time, my family was in no position to decline some assistance because what she was offering was a reward for information. So we thought, wow, this is great. And no one had offered us that avenue to pursue a reward in my sister's case. And so we jumped on it. And before we knew it, we were working with her to get this $75,000 reward up and running. And during that process, we kind of saw a couple red flags, and one of them was we spoke to a lawyer, and the lawyer said that we should make sure that our family wasn't going to be held liable for producing $75,000.
Ah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so the lawyer recommended that we get a letter of indemnification to protect us against having to pay out that reward because that's a lot of money.
So
And
that's sort of like the people who are giving the reward in association with you saying, hey,
mm,
we either have this money or we have the insurance policy for the money or whatever it is, and
yeah,
you will never have to pay this out if something goes wrong.
right. Yeah. So this was all new to us. So I'm so thankful that we did consult a lawyer. And so we did do this letter of indemnification. And through this process, of course, my family had been in contact with other families in the true crime space. And one of the individuals that we had close relationship to gave us a chilling warning about LaDonna.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but at that point, it was too late. The train was off. The train left the station, and the reward was in the works. We felt comfortable and good because we had this letter of indemnification, and so the reward was posted in the early fall, and it was to expire at the end of the year. So it was only about a 5 month span that tips could come in. And so we let it run and we received a handful of tips. I think there was 7 or 8 total tips.
Oh,
And then the reward expired and we didn't really have anything actionable or tangible that came out of that. And so that was the last that we heard of LaDonna until 10 years later. And
10 years later.
10 years
Wow.
later, LaDonna resurfaced and she made a claim that my family was acting suspicious, in particular, my dad, and that he wanted to monitor all the tips that came in, which was kind of ridiculous because the way the tips came in was through a automated voicemail system that LaDonna was the only one that had access to, or I should say, her nonprofit, Let's Bring Them Home. She would get the voicemails and then forward them to my Aunt Helena. Sometimes she'd forward them directly to my dad. And at that point, it was relatively early on in the investigation. My sister went missing in 2004, so we're talking 3 years later. So we're busy, running around trying to talk to investigators, do our own research and things like that. So um, this claim becomes public that my dad wanted to control and monitor all the tips, and an email was produced as evidence that my dad wanted to screen all the calls. And so,
It's just sort of
yeah,
like stepping back here for a second. So,
yeah,
so the reward happens. It's for a matter of months. It's supposed to be for $75,000. A handful of tips come in. Then 10 years later, sort of out of the blue, no prompting, no interaction, no you guys in the news are saying anything about her. All of a sudden, the story about your dad being controlling over the reward comes out for no reason that you can figure out.
correct. Yep.
Okay.
No heads up, totally blindsided. And
So if the listeners are confused right now, you are as confused as they are.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, I am. So thankfully, my dad's not that computer savvy, and he is convinced that he needs to never delete anything ever. So um, which helped in this situation. So I had all of the emails from that time frame, and I looked through all the emails and the exchanges. I also have access to my aunt Helena, who passed away, all of her exchanges. So I think this story was kind of put out there, hoping that we didn't actually have all the original correspondence, but we did. So I, yeah, so
And,
I
and
pulled. Go ahead.
and Helena was like the main point of contact with like the media and the
Right.
people for the award. So she was in communication with LaDonna, and so was your dad.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So I tried to find this email where my dad says I need to see all the tips before they go to law enforcement, which is crazy because the tips would come to my aunt Helena and then she'd forward them to my dad and then they would forward them to law enforcement. That's how it happened. The tips, the tip line never fed directly to law enforcement. And I don't believe that LaDonna was forwarding those tips directly to law enforcement. She fed them to my family.
Mm.
And then we would send them to the investigators. Um, so this idea that my family was going to be bypassed in this process was never the way that it was described to us when we first launched the reward. So that was confusing. So anyway, I find the email from that date and the exact email, and it looks completely different than what
Mm.
was posted online. So that
Mm.
adds a whole nother layer of confusion for my family because I wanted to know where is his email? I don't have it. There's no outbound emails. My dad never sent that. Um, and
So
now
it seems
then
like it was a fabrication or an
well,
editing of a real email or something along those lines.
yeah, I'm not gonna venture to guess
Right.
how it happened. All I can say is I don't have a record of that email, but I do have a record of the exact email from that date, from that time, and it looks different.
Yeah.
So make of that what you will.
Yep. Yep.
Um, so you know, I got in contact with Javier and he asked if I had any interaction with LaDonna. And I told him very limited, but there was this one situation about this reward. And that was the only interaction that my family had with her. And so I just told Javier the story, matter of fact, and provided him with all of the correspondence, not just that one in question, but all of them, so that he could look for himself. And then I find out that there were other families that had somewhat similar experiences,
Hmm.
and we were all sort of siloed and had no connection whatsoever, other than the fact that we had come across Miss Humphrey at one point in time. And so, I just told Javier my experience, and then, of course, I listened to the other stories on the Pretend podcast, and I'm just blown away with what I heard.
You had mentioned when we were talking earlier that at first you were thinking you wouldn't appear on Javier's podcast. What changed your mind?
Well, I'll tell you because again, I go on. I try to decide what I'm going to use my energy and what I'm going to spend my time on. If it's Mara centered, if it's going to further the case. In my mind, this had nothing to do with Mara because it's not even real. And so I didn't want to get pulled into any sort of sideshow circus. And I saw that this had the potential to do that. So I provided Javier with my story and I respectfully declined to go on record. Then I get a notification that the first episode was coming out. It was dropping. And the title was Who's Afraid of LaDonna Humphrey? And I sat back in my chair and thought to myself, I'm afraid of LaDonna Humphrey, and I don't like it. And I don't like that about myself. And I shouldn't be afraid just to tell what happened. And I can prove it. And I have all the emails. So I contacted Javier and I said, I am afraid of LaDonna Humphrey, but I hate it. And so I want to go on record and I want to just share my story in hopes that it gives somebody else the courage to come forward.
Oh, that's awesome. I had mentioned this to you before that, I hadn't done a ton of research into your sister's case because during the time where your sister initially went missing, I was going through a very difficult time in my own life, and I never really sort of caught up with it along the way. But I did do some research, and it made me wonder whether some of the negative things that LaDonna was saying about your dad kind of poisoned, for whatever motive it was, the views of your family. And I'm wondering whether those of us sort of, and I don't know whether this was your intent, but I'm wondering whether having some of these conversations like Javier is, or that we're having right now, will help people see, well, one, that maybe some of those perceptions were wrong, but also to just be very, very careful in our consuming of information.
Yeah, I think confirmation bias is a huge factor in how consumers base their perception of some of these stories. And that's certainly the case with my family. There's so many articles, blogs, videos out there saying that my family acted suspiciously and we're odd and we didn't behave the way that they normal people that experience tragedy behaves, whatever that is. And so people latch on to this type of story and say, oh, there it is. I knew it. The Murrays are suspicious. And it's based on a false premise. And that just adds to their confirmation bias that they are seeking. And it's very hurtful to my family and my sister's case because then people are less likely to feel like she's deserving of answers or resolution because her family is involved or her family isn't telling the truth, whatever the case may be. But it's a very real thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you pushed past your fear of LaDonna Humphrey, which I'm kind of doing myself right now. But one of the things I was wondering about, like, is there any in looking back at that situation? I know you weren't heavily involved; your dad was. Any like tips for people? Because I know when, whether it's because of true crime or something else, but when you get a lot of media attention, some unsavory characters will pop up. Looking back, is there any advice you'd have for people when it comes to sort of like people gravitating toward you when you're in the news or something along those lines?
Yeah, I would say you have to do your due diligence. You've got to take the time to do your research, talk to other people that have interacted with the particular person that you're considering working with. And it's time consuming, but in the long run, you're going to save yourself a lot of headache by doing that. And try to spend as much time with the person off record and try to understand them and their motivations before you sign up for something that you can't ever take back.
I'm Jason Blair, and this is a Silver Linings Handbook podcast, Patreon only bonus episode. We'll see you guys all again soon.